Late afternoon, and a young man is standing in front of a collapsing tobacco barn in a bee veil, holding a smoker that's just started to catch. The barn's set to be bulldozed in a week. Counties condemned it, too far gone to save. Nobody wants what's living inside the north wall except him. He works the smoker slow, puffing gentle streams into a gap in the siding, waiting, patient as a man with nowhere else to be, while a low hum builds up out of the boards like the barn itself is breathing. He's not there to burn the hive out the way most people would. He's there to take it home alive. By the end of this one, you'll understand exactly why a condemned barn full of angry bees was worth an afternoon of careful, dangerous work. If this is your first time with us, go ahead and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We like knowing who's along for these stories. Now let's go back to where this one really starts. Cutter's Fork sits in the knob country of eastern Kentucky, a valley of steep, rounded hills too rough for row crops, but good for tobacco allotments, cattle, and not much else, since the tobacco buyouts thinned that business down to almost nothing. About 600 people live along the fork itself, strung out along a road that follows the creek because there wasn't anywhere flatter to put it. There's a Dollar General, a Church of Christ, a volunteer fire department, and a livestock sale barn that still draws a decent Saturday crowd. Jonah Pruitt was 19 the year this story starts, living with his grandfather on a place that used to run 40 acres of burley tobacco before the market fell out from under it. Jonah wasn't the kind of young man anybody in Cutter's Fork expected much from. He'd finished high school without much fanfare, worked odd jobs mowing and fencing for neighbors, quiet enough that people sometimes forgot he was in the room. What people didn't know was that Jonah noticed things closely, where wild bees nested in old fence posts, which fields bloomed thick with clover, the small patterns most folks walk past without seeing. What started it all was a phone call from a neighbor whose barn had bees in the wall, and a demolition date already set. The neighbor wanted the bees gone, one way or another, and didn't much care how. Jonah, who'd read a little about beekeeping the winter before out of boredom more than ambition, asked if he could try taking them out alive instead of letting the county's contractor spray them before knocking the barn down. The man who taught him to do it right was Otis Renfro, 79, who'd kept bees in Cutter's Fork for over 50 years and had a reputation for being about as easy to approach as a bull in a bad mood. Otis wasn't friendly the first time Jonah showed up at his gate asking about cutout removals, pulling a live colony out of a wall or barn intact, comb and all, without destroying the bees in the process. He told Jonah that most people who tried cutouts without proper training got stung bad, killed the queen by accident, or lost the whole colony to shock within a week and sent him off without much more than a warning. Jonah came back anyway, twice more, the second time with a notebook full of questions about comb transfer and rubber banding brood frames into new equipment. Otis finally let him tag along on a removal, mostly, Otis admitted later, to prove the point that it'd go wrong. It didn't go perfectly, but Jonah kept his head, followed instructions, and didn't panic when the smoker went out halfway through. That was enough for Otis to keep teaching him. The piece of wisdom Otis handed him early, and one Jonah repeated for years after, was this: bees ain't mean. They're careful. You get stung because you moved like you had somewhere else to be. Slow down, and they'll mostly leave you be to do the same. The first cutout Jonah tried solo went badly. He worked too fast, trying to beat the sunset, and in his hurry, he crushed part of the brood comb while cutting it free from the barn wall, killing a good portion of the colony's next generation before it ever hatched. The bees he did save were agitated for days afterward in their new hive box, and it took weeks of careful feeding before the colony stabilized. The second mistake was queenless transfers. On his third removal, Jonah failed to spot the queen in the chaos of comb and bees, and the colony he brought home slowly failed over the following month without her, the worker bees unable to raise a new one from eggs that were too old by the time anyone noticed. Otis taught him afterward to slow down and mark queens with a dot of paint whenever he could find them, so future transfers wouldn't repeat the mistake. The third setback wasn't technical at all, it was money. Jonah spent most of what little he'd saved on proper hive boxes and protective gear before he had any honey to sell, and for a stretch that spring, his grandfather openly doubted whether the whole thing would ever pay for itself. Word got around Cutter's Fork the way it does. Jonah's grandfather, Carl Pruitt, wasn't cruel about it, but he said plainly more than once that Jonah was playing with a hobby that stings instead of finding steady work. A few of the men at the sale barn laughed along when Carl brought it up. But Jonah's cousin Lacey, 17, who was scared enough of bees to keep her distance from every hive, still drove him to pick up used equipment and helped him build hive stands out of scrap lumber, because that's what you do for family, fear of stinging insects notwithstanding. The turn came at the county fair the following August, almost by accident. Jonah entered a jar of his first real honey harvest in the open class competition, mostly because Lacey talked him into it. His honey won first place, a clean, complex wildflower blend pulled from clover and sourwood blooming across the knobs, judged against jars from established local beekeepers who'd been at it for decades. Nobody made a speech about it. The ribbon just went up on the board, and people who walked past the honey table started asking who J. Pruitt was, since most of Cutter's Fork had no idea Jonah kept bees at all. Carl was at the fair that day. He didn't say much to Jonah about the ribbon directly, but he mentioned to a neighbor within earshot that he hadn't figured a boy could win anything against Otis Renfro's honey, which Jonah's had, by a full point on the judges' card. The real test came the following spring, when Jonah had scaled up to 11 hives across 2 properties. A disease called American foulbrood turned up in 1 hive, a highly contagious bacterial infection that can wipe out an entire apiary if it spreads, and that often requires burning infected equipment rather than risk it contaminating everything else. It was the kind of threat that could have undone 2 years of careful work overnight. Jonah caught it early because Otis had drilled him on what early-stage foulbrood looked like: a sunken, discolored cap on brood cells, a faint sourness to the smell, and confirmed it with a state apiary inspector rather than guessing. On the inspector's advice, he burned the one infected hive and all its equipment rather than risk it spreading. A hard loss, but a contained one, and quarantined the surrounding hives with new equipment and strict hygiene for months afterward. It wasn't a dramatic rescue. It was a hard, quiet decision to destroy something he'd built in order to save the rest. Made calmly because Otis had already taught him what to watch for and what to do about it. The other 10 hives came through clean. By the following year, Jonah was doing regular cutout removals for neighbors around Cutter's Fork and 2 adjoining counties, building his apiary almost entirely from colonies other people wanted destroyed, and selling honey, beeswax candles, and small nucleus colonies to other beginning beekeepers. Winter remained the hardest season every year. Kentucky winters are mild enough that bees don't fully cluster the way they would further north, which means colonies can burn through stored honey faster than expected during warm spells, then get caught short in a hard freeze. Jonah learned to check hive weight by hand lifting the back of each box through the cold months, supplementing with sugar fondant when a colony felt light, rather than trusting the calendar alone. Carl's arc through all this stayed mostly quiet. He started helping Jonah haul hive boxes on removal days instead of staying home, first without saying much about why, then as a standing habit most weekends. He never made a scene about changing his opinion. He just started showing up for the parts of the work that needed an extra pair of hands. It was Carl who finally said, plainly, what the rest of Cutter's Fork had mostly stopped arguing about anyway. It happened on an ordinary Saturday, loading empty hive boxes into the truck bed after a removal job 2 farms over. Nothing dramatic about the moment at all. Didn't figure there was a living in bees nobody wanted, Carl said, mostly to himself. Guess I was wrong about that. That was the whole exchange. No apology beyond it, no speech. Just an old man saying the plain truth once it had become too obvious to keep arguing with. Cutter's Fork doesn't look dramatically different today. The Dollar General's still there. The sale barn still draws its Saturday crowd. But when a barn or an old house in the valley turns up bees now, more than a few people call Jonah before they call an exterminator. And Otis, well into his 80s, still rides along on removals some weekends, mostly for the company. Jonah's 23 now, running close to 40 hives, with a standing honey order at 2 stores in the county seat, and Lacey helping most weekends. Still not entirely over her nerves around an open hive, but showing up anyway. What changed in Cutter's Fork wasn't the economy. It was smaller than that. A quiet young man looked at what everyone else wanted destroyed, and instead of arguing with the people who doubted him, he slowed down, did the careful work Otis taught him, and let the honey speak for itself. That's the story from Cutter's Fork. If you enjoyed it, subscribe for more, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'll see you next time.